Can you hear me now, John?
That's the weirdest introduction ever. Okay, we're ready.
Okay.
Where can I turn for peace? Where is my soul rest? When other sources cease to make me whole. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for this day, thankful for the many blessings we receive from thee, grateful for the opportunity we have to meet together to discuss these essays. Ask that thou bless us with thy Spirit, that it may lead us and guide us. Pray for these things in the name of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so just before, well, first of all, reminder, we're down to our last couple days here. We've got today on Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints, and tomorrow on Book of Mormon translation, and then Monday we'll assemble the things. I am leaving on family vacation Monday immediately after, so I welcome everyone to come and type quickly. But we should be able to put things. Oh,
Lost deferment.
This could get ugly tomorrow. So we will put it all together. Make sure that you've got quotes inserted so that we're able to do it. And I really don't think it's going to be that bad. I haven't put together the example for it yet, but tomorrow afternoon I'm going to be putting it all together. And if you aren't here for it, that'll be fine. I'll have a screencast just like this, except for it'll be dramatically shorter. Wow. Pop-ups really hit me at 8 o'clock every day. So even if you aren't here, you should have the information and the quotes and the examples that you can put it together. But again, just make sure that your part is done by then, that you've got the content embedded as much as you can so that you're ready to play. So a couple minutes ago, we were talking right before we started recording, and Ken asked the question, why do we call it Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints instead of just calling it the Mountain Meadow Massacre essay? I don't know. I didn't ask them, but I have a pretty good idea. One would probably try to avoid the phrase. Mountain Meadow Massacre as much as possible. But I used two sources for this, and the main source, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, is the source. Did anybody watch the clip that I put on the blog about this from where Shirley does the interview? It's pretty cool, and he talks about basically what, yeah, the church paid for it, they commissioned it, and then they gave us complete editorial reign. They said, don't hold anything back. We don't even need to proof it before we're done. So I did turn to some people to have them look through it, but it's what it is. And you'll see as the quotes we go through today, they didn't hold anything back. In all of its brutality, they list it all. Special thanks to Mark Burgess for letting me borrow his. I loaned mine to Dalton, and then his wife had a baby, and so it didn't get back to me. But the reason that I like Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints as a title is because the first half, you really have to get the tone. And you really have to understand the context of this whole thing to really understand how Mountain Meadow Massacre happens. Otherwise, you look at it, and all you see is a brutal massacre, and you can't understand how anybody could get to that point. When you look at the context of how it leads up, it makes more sense. It's not excusable in any way, shape, or form. It was an atrocious thing that happened. But you start to, I was saying before, I feel bad for every single person involved in this whole thing. They did terrible things. But a lot of them did terrible things because terrible things were done to them, and they didn't know how to deal with it. So again, I'm not excusing them in any way, but it's a great example of how traumatic mortality can be. Rough Stone Rolling is what I use. The first half of what we cover today, I'm going to be using primarily Rough Stone Rolling as a source because he does a little bit better job mapping out the history in Missouri, I feel like, than Mountain Meadow Massacre does, and that's kind of where it starts. So let's get back and start with some of that history. First couple of paragraphs are nice, and they say basically Latter-day Saints don't condone beating and killing people. And then it makes this statement, which is similar to what I said. While historical context can help shed light on these acts of violence, it does not excuse them. A few years back, we were sitting around as a faculty. Were you there for this one when we discussed Mountain Meadow Massacre? I can't remember. And one member of the faculty who was maybe I shouldn't say too much, but started saying, well, those Arkansas immigrants had it coming with the things that they did. That is not our position. Please never teach that. That's a horrible, horrible way to go about this. We were wrong. That's the correct way to approach this. And then we can show a little bit of context on it. So just to be clear, that is our official position. What had happened to us before does not make it okay what we did. But when we understand the violence and the backup that we have, so remember the mobs driving the Saints out of Jackson County in 1833. That's kind of where we're going to start. And we already get the us versus them mentality. So when they get the revelation to go to Missouri, the revelation actually lists the citizens of Missouri as enemies in the revelation. And this kind of starts the whole thing. And then we start getting some issues. The Saints start gathering to Missouri, and they're very, very bold about what's going to happen. And they have no problem telling the Missouri Saints, here's how it's going to go down. We're going to come, and we're going to possess all of your land because God's going to give it to us, and we're going to run you out.
It's not the Missouri Saints.
Say again?
The Missouri Saints were
Right. The Latter-day Saints are saying, this is our land. God's giving it to us. I need you to put yourself in the position right now of, so first of all, you can see the Saints getting zealous about this, right? And you get a revelation and they're telling you this is going to happen. You're like, this is great. We're going to tell everybody. Kind of similar to Joseph going to his preacher and saying, coolest thing. I got this revelation and God came and spoke to me and he told me your church is wrong and everything you say is an abomination. Isn't that great? And surprisingly, his preacher is not as excited about it as Joseph is. Similarly, the Saints go in and they're like, coolest revelation. We're going to take Missouri. And they expect the Missouri people to be like, yeah, And instead, surprisingly, the Missouri people are like, we're not real keen on this idea. And so we start to get this kind of pushback. Well, at the time, the Missouri citizens come and they say, we got to do something about this. They're literally trying to take over our state. And it's not some maybe they're trying, it's a stated goal. And so they come in and they decide that they're going to put together some vigilante action. This is not uncommon at the time. It sounds crazy today, but it's not uncommon. And they come together and they think that they're fully justified in doing this. And I like this statement. They were not a mob of people in action in their mind. They were doing what they needed to do to defend their lands and their properties and things like that. So, oh, by the way, we talked about this with race in the priesthood. One of the big things is, yeah, if a bunch of people are moving in, that's not that big a deal. If a bunch of people are moving in and inviting all of the blacks in the South to come and join them, now we have a problem. Remember, W.W. Phelps prints that article, "Free People of Color," that he puts in the church newspaper, or well, sort of the church newspaper, almost the church newspaper, and that really incites some anger. We'll show a little more of that in a minute. The Saints come, destroy the printing press, tar and feather W.W. Phelps, and this is their, or the, sorry, not the Saints, the citizens, and this is their report. Citizens reported on July 23rd their committee had entered into an amicable agreement with them. They don't mention the destruction of Phelps's house or Partridge's burns from the corrosive agent and tar. Instead, they say, no blood was spilled, nor any blows inflicted. They were picking and choosing their words a little bit there. Under this new agreement, though, this is the position for the Mormons. Mormons could not vote, they could not own property, they could not print a newspaper, and could not work in the county. Yeah, this is an amicable agreement. So you can already see how the Saints are starting to get a little bit touchy on this. They've already been driven out of Kirtland. Now they're in Missouri, and they're having issues with Missouri. Their fault? Well, maybe. Depending on how you look at it. But you can start to see how the relations are getting tense. Here's a direct quote from one of the citizens. There's an article inviting free Negroes and mulattoes from other states to become Mormons and remove and settle among us. They declare openly that their God hath given them this country of land, and that sooner or later they must and will have possession of our lands for an inheritance. We believe it a duty we owe ourselves, to our wives and children, to the cause of public morals, to remove them from among us. We therefore agree that if after timely warning and receiving an adequate compensation for what little property they cannot take with them, they refuse to leave us in peace as they found us, we agree to use such means as may be sufficient to remove them. Now, obviously, it doesn't quite go quite the way we would usually interpret that, but you can start to see it develop a little bit. Okay. You remember Joseph, a little bit of the violence against Joseph as well. That's at the John Johnson farm, so that's a little bit earlier, where he's drugged from the home and tarred and feathered, and they actually have Dr. Dennison, is it? It's in there somewhere. Dennison. That comes in and they have him set to castrate Joseph, and the doctor kind of gets a little weak stomach when he realizes what's going on and says, "No, I'm not doing that." But they try to shove a vial of poison into his mouth and chip one of his teeth and some things like that. And then, of course, we get Liberty Jail. And the food, I know we emphasize Liberty Jail and the cold and things like that, but the food more than anything. This is their beloved prophet. You love this guy. Imagine somebody mistreating President Nelson and how that would make you feel. And the Gray remembered the food so filthy that we could not eat it until we were driven to it by hunger. When they fell to vomiting after a meal, Hiram suspected poison. After the attack, he said, we would lie 2 or 3 days in a torpid, stupid state, not even caring or wishing for life. Joseph said only that the food was scant, uniform, and coarse. And they're really abusing him. And then the people would come by. There's a church movie they put out where they show the people taunting them outside the window, and they just describe it as an absolute hell. Now that's while they're in there. We also get Hansville Massacre that goes on, where they come in and what do we have? 17. At least 17 men and boys ranging in age from 9 to 78 were slaughtered in the Hansville Massacre. Some Latter-day Saint women were raped or otherwise sexually assaulted during the Missouri persecutions. Are you starting to see the bad blood yet as we look at it in context? And imagine each time this happens, if you're one of the saints and you're trying to still practice Christ-like attributes and stuff, but the more that this happens, the more bitter and enraged you get about things. We'll talk a little bit more about vigilantes destroying homes when we get to the Danites. Oh, and then of course there's the part where Joseph and Hiram get martyred. That doesn't help really either. They're pushed out. They have to go to winter quarters. While they're in winter quarters, 1 in 12 dies. That's a significant quote in there too. Great quote on what that was like. Okay. So the saints start to get, I don't know if I want to call it a victim complex because they were victims. It's not like it was fake. They had a lot of hard things happen. It was legal to kill saints. But they're recognizing that they've been persecuted significantly by these people. And each time you start wondering how much longer can I go before I step back up and I fight back against these people. And that's, I think, ranging from the lowest ranking saints all the way up to Brigham Young, you'll see here in a minute. So the saints appealed to Missouri Governor Daniel Duncan, and his statement to them is that we need help, is what they're saying. He said that public sentiment, he replied, may become paramount law, and it is useless to run counter to it. It is the republic. In this republic, the vox populi is the vox dei, where the voice of the people is the voice of God. And don't you just hate him for that? You spineless weasel of a man, we think. Okay, so let's put it in context a little bit, okay? Because here's what Sidney Rigdon says. Flipping it, because when the saints had numbers. Sidney Rigdon says, close to the same time, use the majority's concept of vox populi and telling dissenters to leave the saints' communities. You don't like it? Leave. Which is the same thing that we always tell people when they don't like the rules at BYU, right? Or they don't want to live in unity. They get out. We kind of adopt some of these same things, but not as extreme. When a county or body of people have individuals among them with whom they do not wish to associate, said Rigdon, and a public expression is taken against the remaining among them, and such individuals do not remove, it is the principle of republicanism itself that gives that community a right to expel them forcibly. That's a Mormon saying that. So you can see that this road is going both ways at this point in time. So again, we got to be careful not to view it too much from 2018 perspective. And this would really get you fired up today. Vigilantes generally targeted minority groups or those perceived to be criminal or socially marginal. Such acts were at times fueled by religious rhetoric. And you'll see that when the saints get there. Again, they want numbers. And we have the army coming, and Brigham says, everybody on a mission, come home. Because we need numbers. Because vox populi, vox dei, right? And if we have the numbers, then we win. Okay. This is important too. 1792, Congress passes a law requiring every able-bodied male between 18 and 45 years of age to belong to a community militia. That ends up causing some serious issues. I shouldn't say causing issues, but being one of the main contributors to the Mountain Meadow Massacre stuff, because we have all these locally organized militias, and communication is a little bit scant at the time. You can't just send them a text message. And you've got guys that are kind of a ragtag band of people together, and it makes it really easy for them to act out of line with higher up leaders. Communications broke down. Okay, let's talk some Danites here. Anybody really familiar with Danite stuff? A little bit, at least. Okay. Feel free to help me out with this. The trouble with finding information on Danites is that they were intended to be kind of secretive. And so the records are a little bit shady. start by just reeling some stuff off. Samuel Avard is really the leader of the Danites. Samson, that's what I meant, sorry. Samson Avard is the leader of the Danites, and from what we can gather, seems to take a look at Joseph and see an opportunity for him to get power. Realizing that he can put together this group and lead this basically military group, or militant group anyways, and do it in the name of, we're going to follow the prophet, and get these people really zealous and extreme about following Joseph. And anytime that you need to drum up some excitement about something, you say, well, don't we want to defend Joseph? And he cashes in on that. Later on, he leaves the church and apostatizes and basically says, yeah, it was all shit. We see no evidence that he was ever really interested in the church in general. He just wants his moment of glory and his chance to rise to power. The reason that that's controversial, and there's some things that get in the way, we get okay, so a couple of quotes from them. John Corll says, for it seemed that they felt justified and thought it was the will of God to use any measures whatever, whether lawful or unlawful, to accomplish their end. This is the problem you can see with the Danites. It doesn't matter what the law says, but can you see again, they're looking at it and saying, yeah, you know who else doesn't care about the law? Missouri. And so you can see how this gets complicated. Another issue, George Robinson is Joseph's close to journal writer. I don't know if journal writer is the right phrase or not. I guess he uses it in there. He records all of Joseph's actions. He's a big supporter of the Danites. And so you have to wonder, when he's recording, and he's not dictating from Joseph, he's recording. Does that make sense, the difference? It's not that Joseph's sitting there and saying, now write this. It's that they're going along the day and he's writing down what Joseph says and how Joseph feels about things. And there's a lot of opportunity for personal opinion to creep in here, and it appears that maybe it has. It's hard to tell, but it appears that maybe it has. Sidney Rigdon. They had a set of men among them that had, this is a sermon that he preaches, that had dissented from the church and were doing all in their power to destroy the presidency, laying plans to take their lives, and accused them of counterfeiting, lying, cheating, and numerous other crimes, and called on the people to rise in mass and rid the county of such a nuisance. Joseph gets up after that. Joseph's at the meeting, and Joseph's response, all we get recorded is, I don't want the brethren to act unlawfully. But they take that as, well, he still wants us. That was a wink and a nod type of a thing. And they kind of embrace it. This was a really great breakdown. Again, the Missouri had to follow the law, why should we, type of thing. Let's see. Joseph later condemns the Danites, many false and pernicious things, which were calculated to lead the saints far astray. That's a little bit about him being a target. Okay, so the first time we really start seeing the Danites come out, William Penniston is a Whig, one of the prominent parties at the time, and he's really wanting the Mormon support. And they kind of hint a little bit that they might support him, and then they pull back and they support a different candidate. That makes him a little bit upset. So he goes and he preaches, or he goes and gives this fiery speech and says that we can't let the Mormons vote. And a bunch of the Missouri citizens gather around the polls to basically block any Mormon from ever coming to vote. And then they use some language that's pretty incendiary for the time. 2 or 3 dozen, they're trying to, about 100 of them trying to scare off a few dozen of the Mormons. One Missourian announced to the Mormons that Mormons should not vote no more than Negroes, which is fighting words in those times, right? That was really demeaning to say something like that. A fight breaks out. There's some rocks and some punches and some clubs, and this is Missouri, right? It's the rough and tumble Wild West. But again, then word gets back to Far West, and as things go with Mormons, the story gets bigger as it gets back to Far West. And by the time it gets back to Far West, what had really been just a basic brawl turns into 2 or 3 murdered Mormons lying in the streets of Gallatin. So Danites assemble, and they all start getting together, and Abar gathers these guys together, and he invites Joseph to come. Joseph comes with him, not as a leader, but he comes with him. When they get there, they realize that the story has been blown out of proportion a little bit, but decide to do a little bit of a show of force anyways. And the Danites start taking a little bit of power at this point. Now, as we go on, we've got the Danites, and they take most of the blame for this stuff, but we talked about some of the vigilante action that they're taking. They decide that they need to expel the people out of the county, and they get into this kind of battle. So Mormon strategy went beyond protection of their own people to attacking suspected mobbers. Mormon militia were to confiscate the property of hostile Davie citizens and force them to move, thus destroying the vigilantes' home base. Enemies only were to be attacked. The confiscated property was to be deposited in the bishop's storehouse for the use of Mormons who had suffered losses in earlier battles. We're getting into sketchy area here. We're doing some things that are pretty ethically questionable. But you can see again the background that leads into that. In Gallatin, the company under David Patton removed the goods from Stolling's store, and the building was burned. A tailor shop received similar treatment. Elsewhere, about 50 buildings were burned. 50 buildings, you guys, that's a lot of buildings. Especially when you think about the size of cities in that time, 50 is a lot. This is national headline news today, let alone back in a time like that. Elsewhere, around 50 buildings were burned. Within 4 days, Joseph's uncle John Smith reported that we have driven most of the enemy out of the county. Okay, so the Mormons come back. Their side of the story is a little bit different, and it depends on which side of history you read. Their story is Missouri really wanted to stick it to us. They burned their own buildings and blamed it on us. And there might be some truth to that. Someday we'll find out. But this is an interesting point. Parley Pratt makes this statement. It is said that some of our own troops, exasperated to the highest degree, retaliated in some instances by plundering and burning houses and bringing the spoil to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, whose provisions and clothing had been robbed from them. And upon the whole, I am rather inclined to believe it was the case, for human nature cannot endure all things. That seems to me to be a pretty good case that, yeah, some of this stuff that they say happened really did happen. Okay, we're about the history. Do you see why it's important to get the background on this and understand the bad blood that's going on? Violence in Utah. There's a lot of history to cover today. They're still pretty tense. The American Indians thing, I don't know. There is some bad blood there a little bit between the Saints and the American Indians, but by and large, a lot better relationship than a typical traveler has. They're doing pretty good, and they're making a lot of trades with them. But the relationship's different than what they're used to with white people coming through. They're used to white people coming through as hunters and trappers, and they have this one-time relationship where they go and they say, hey, we'll trade you this for this, and they say, fine, and they do, yeah, that's fine. Now you've got people that are settling, and the views of land usage from the American Indians to the Mormon settlers are wildly different. And the American Indians are saying, you're using our land, we deserve some of the goods from it. And the Mormons are saying, that's not how America works. This is our land, and you go grow your own stuff. And there's a little bit of pushback there. They have some incidents. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more later, maybe not. We'll see. Oh, and then we get into some issues too. I meant to put this in. I forgot to put this quote in. Brigham Young wearing the two hats is a problem. He's the governor. He's also the prophet. And which one is he doing when? So you remember when the Saints come in, it's 1857. Rebaptism is still a thing. In fact, Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff both get rebaptized, I think 7 times. Either 6 or 7 times. And the idea being a fresh start. In fact, a lot of times when they'd split a ward, they would rebaptize all of the new ward because we're having a fresh start. When they came into the valley in 1847, a lot of them get rebaptized because it's a fresh start. Well, with that in mind, Brigham gets up one day speaking to the state legislator, and again, I'm just trying to demonstrate this two hats, how confusing it gets, because later on we're looking at trying to figure out church leaders versus military leaders, and who's speaking, the state president or the militia leader. So, anyways, Brigham Young gets up in the state legislature and he's speaking to them, and he's calling them to repentance, using the words repentance, and then he calls to disassemble the state legislature for the day and says, "We're going to meet back together later on this evening. Everybody take the rest of the day off, go home and get ready. We're going to go get rebaptized." And he says this to all of the representatives of the state legislature. Can you see the lines blurred just a little bit with that type of a thing? Imagine doing that today, asking Congress to disassemble so that we can all go get baptized by someone with priesthood authority. So the lines get pretty blurred here, and that causes some problems. Okay. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the relationship with the Indians. The Reformation is a pretty interesting study. The Reformation is the epitome of Brigham Young. Kind of this strong words type of a position on things. His statement was, so they come across the plains. Jack sent me a couple of articles on this to read, and they come across the plains, and basically they get sloppy. You ever come home from vacation, you live out of your suitcase for a couple of days, rather than clean everything up and put it away? The Saints have been living out of wagons for a long time, and they've been crossing the plains, and the yards are getting sloppy, and the things are just not well kept, and they're spending a lot of time. Brigham has a real kind of vendetta against cards and checkers, and he's concerned about this type of a thing. And just, the states are wasting their time, and that's before we get into the more serious crimes of adultery and some of the stuff that was just sloppy. And you want them to kind of tighten things up and be more formal. So his statement, instead of smooth, beautiful, sweet, silk, velvet-lipped preaching, he said, the people needed sermons like peals of thunder, and they get it. And the real incendiary stuff that he says, he starts preaching blood atonement. If the man was found guilty of adultery, he must have his blood shed. This is more than one occasion. I don't know. Some of you might know better. We don't have any record of that ever happening, do we? I haven't read anything on it. Does anybody know? I would think that it would be a little more published if we did. And a lot of the saints recognize that. They see that this is rhetoric that is being thrown out there, more so than Brigham actually planning on spilling the blood of people that have done something. This is largely rhetoric intended to drive the people out that don't want to live this way. Again, this concept of push out the people that aren't like us, and to get the people that are going to stay to kind of tighten things up and be a little more strict. Alex.
Didn't Brigham Young, in the same vein, talk about blood atonement, talk about how you need to be righteous in order to understand enough. If we're not pure enough, we won't be able to recognize direction.
Yeah. But you're saying, the idea being then you're saying it's more of a pitch on righteousness to be able to identify things. Yeah, Ken.
Although I don't know if we have any official blood atonement example, there was a little bit of historical vigilantism, citizens taking care of it in their own hands without any official. I mean, there was people even later on after they abolished polygamy that practiced polygamy, and somebody would call it adultery and come to shoot a polygamist just because they thought that was their right.
So Ken's saying that there was obviously some people taking things into their own hands later, and that's why this is so dangerous. Saying, "Oh, polygamy's done. You're practicing polygamy, adultery, bang bang." Yeah, you can see, and again, that's the whole context we're trying to set up. Is Brigham says these things, and you see how it puts people on edge, and they start getting the idea: if somebody crosses us, the appropriate way to handle this is you're done. We're going to take care of it. One part of Southern Utah local church authorities told the teachers, meaning the priesthood teachers, to search church members' private boxes and drawers to see that everything is clean and pure. One member remembered that the teacher's intrusion could be a fearful ordeal resulting in embarrassment and false confessions. They're so terrified of this, people are just confessing just to get them to stop. I don't know exactly what they're looking for. That's a little bit unclear. You read those records and we want to read them from our perspective. But I want you just to imagine this. This unlawful search and seizure going on by the church. Just imagine this day, and I know teachers were a little bit different back in the day, but imagine the teachers come bursting into your house to go through all of your stuff. And how that makes things go. And there's a couple pursuits. One, it's going to be obviously wildly intrusive, but also think about how that affects the way you act and the things you say when you know that this is what happens if you don't. Okay, tensions are getting higher. That's about all the time we can spend on the Reformation, but it's a fascinating topic. Okay, so we get up to 1857. More specifically, July 24th, 1857, which is the 10-year anniversary of the Saints arriving in Salt Lake. So they're actually having this giant party. They're out till basically morning. They literally party all night at this. And about that same time, a couple of writers come in and let Brigham Young know that President Buchanan, is it? President Buchanan comes in, and he's sending someone to replace Brigham Young as the governor of Utah. And so they hold this little meeting, and they come together. At the end of the meeting, they agree on two things. First, the Mormons would accept the new territorial appointees, but only if they would behave themselves, Young said. I'll step down. That'll be okay. However, they've got an army coming. Harney and the army were different. If he crossed the South Pass, the main route into Utah, and roughly the territory's east border, there would be a fight, and the buzzards should pick his bones, Young said. The Saints would no more submit to oppression, either to individuals, towns, countries, states, or nation. Okay, can you start to see how this can get misconstrued as he starts to pitch this? Same time, they get news of Parley P. Pratt having been murdered. So Parley P. Pratt goes to San Francisco on a mission in 1854. He meets Eleanor McLean. Eleanor McLean's husband has been beating her. She joins the church. That's the straw that breaks the back. He takes her children and sends them to her parents in New Orleans and divorces her, or at least she gets a divorce. She goes back to get the kids. In the way through, she stops in Salt Lake, becomes one of Parley P. Pratt's plural wives. And eventually Parley gets sent out in 1856 on a mission with specific instructions. You are to focus on the church. I don't want you intermingling things, which he sort of does. But in the end, Eleanor ends up getting the kids back, and she's coming back, and Parley meets up with her to kind of usher her back to Utah. Obviously, people are upset about that. They end up both getting arrested, and by now, this custody battle is like major national news. People are following it. So they have this little trial where they're arrested. They end up getting free. There's 500 people that gather to watch this trial. The judge lets them free. He turns to Parley P. Pratt and offers him a gun and a knife, as I recall. Is that right? Gun or knife, is that what it is? Parley's response: "Gentlemen, I do not rely on weapons," Pratt said when a judge released him early in the morning and offered him a knife and pistol to protect himself. Here we go into gun rights and which one's the better approach, I guess. Hector McLean says, "Great, so good to know. Glad to know that you aren't armed." Tracks him down, fires a half a dozen bullets at his victim and stabbed him twice. Leaves him there for a while, comes back and fires another bullet into Pratt's neck just to kind of make sure, and he dies of his wounds later that day. I know, right? Seven shots and 2 stabs, and he hangs in there. Probably be Pratt's a tough sucker. Who knows what that means? Maybe they officially announce him dead later that day. Okay, so this idea gets back now. This is going on in Arkansas. Okay, so you've got the army coming in. We're going to fight this time. We bring that army and we're going to come and get you. And then we've got people in Arkansas murdering our apostles, and all of this is kind of coming together, and you're starting to see the background. Again, I hope that now you're starting to see why they have the longer title instead of just Mountain Meadow Massacre. This was a whole thing. Okay. Oh, and this is interesting. Newspaper reports from the eastern United States that celebrated the crime reached Utah in June 1857. Hurrah for the Mormon killers, basically. Okay, we're finally up to what we're going to talk about. We're going to kind of get to the climax of the story really quickly, and then we're going to go back and view some of the details. There's some clashes along the way that they have with local Mormons about grazing cattle. There'll be times when they come in and they have a fenced-off field, and they'll just let down the fences and let their cattle in to graze. And the Mormons will come out and they'll say, "Hey, you can't do that." And their response is, "This here is Uncle Sam's land, and we're Uncle Sam's boys, and we're going to do what we want." At which point, in one story, they go and they assemble the militia, and they say, "You've got 1 hour to be gone." And they assemble the militia, and they go and they do a little militia training exercise just a few hundred yards away from their camp, just to put a little bit of a scare into them. Brigham Young institutes a policy: we're not going to sell to these immigrants. We're keeping all of our provisions. We don't want anything getting to the other side to fight against us. We're better situated than they are. Don't sell your stuff. Well, that is really frustrating when you're trying to make it to California and you've been walking for a couple of months, and you get there and you say, "Hey, I could use some grain," and they say, "Not selling. Sorry, I don't have anything for you." And you're saying, "Really? Because I see a barn full of grain." "No, we're not selling." And that gets them a little worked up. So some of the immigrants, upon hearing that, they decide that they make some threats. "Well, then we're going to join the army and we're going to wipe you out." Yeah. Okay. Let's fast forward. We're going to come back to some of those details, and let's get to the actual week or so where this all goes down. They start making some pretty legitimate threats. In fact, some of these guys are making threats about how, first of all, they're going to join the army and wipe the floor with the Mormons, but also they're saying things like, they're claiming that they've got the gun that murdered Joseph. And they're claiming that they were there. They were part of the mob that takes Joseph and Hiram out. It's pretty tender stuff to the Saints. And that gets things pretty riled up. Yeah, we're going to break the way I was going to do this originally. But they get into Cedar City, and I'll show you his name in a minute. I can't remember his name. But he breaks the policy of not selling and sells them some grain. And they take the grain down to the mill, and they want to get the grain milled. And the miller says, "Yeah, I'll mill the grain for you for a cow," which is outrageous. That's ridiculous. And they get all worked up and excited about it, and they demand that they go to the mayor's house. They get to the mayor's house, and they're throwing a fit, and they're cursing and talking about how they're going to take the Mormons down. And in the meantime, they say, "We're going to take whatever we want because we can." There's a 65-year-old woman across the street who has some chickens running in her lawn. They go and they shoot the chickens and take them, and then they start cursing at this woman and threaten her with a pistol. And now they've insulted the honor of every man in Cedar City in their minds. And they say, "We've got to get them." And that's kind of the tipping point that starts sending this downhill. But it's interesting. Not all of the Saints get all riled up. I think sometimes we imagine the whole town of Cedar City grab their pitchforks and heads out. They don't all go. In fact, when they get the call to Mountain Meadows, and we'll talk about how we get there in a minute, there's quite a few of them that just refuse. Joseph Walker, when told to go to Mountain Meadows, put his fist in Hate's face and told him to go to hell and do his own dirty work. On account, another man claimed that his stepbrothers hid in the furrows of a potato patch until the cedar party went on. Peter Nelson reportedly concealed. This is my favorite story. I don't know how legitimate this story is, but it was in the book. Peter Nelson reportedly concealed himself in a bit of grain and escaped the soldiers' detection by breathing through a straw. It's kind of an intense version of hiding, but yet another man supposedly dodged service by claiming to be ill, first lying in a pile of hot bricks to simulate a fever. You're not sick, I am. This is the old trick you do as a kid, right? I am. Feel me. Feel how warm I am. I'm burning up. So this is what's the interesting quote out of here. The reason I put this in. All told, less than 1/5 of Cedar's military men went to the meadows. That's an interesting statistic. We don't always get. But remember, at the same time, Isaac Haight is not just the militia leader, he's the state president. And so when he says to do something, people listen, and it's awfully blurred. Am I listening to my state president, or am I listening to my militia leader? So the immigrants come through, they're moving on, and the Saints are boiling over, or at least a lot of them are. And they say, we got to do something about this. But Haight has a superior in Parowan. I don't remember all the rankings, but his name is Dame. What's Dame's first name? William Dame. Okay. And he has to get approval from Dame. And he sends out a rider to go see what Dame has to say. And Dame's like, relax. Take it easy. Words are but wind, he says. But they can't let it go. And so Haight calls in John D. Lee, and they have this meeting. They're kind of on similar rankings. John D. Lee, it's actually debatable who's higher, but before the meeting ends, Lee said, and they put together this plan to kind of put a little bit of a scare into him. And the idea is Brigham has called off. Brigham has said, we're no longer going to protect the immigrants coming through from the Indians. And their interpretation of this, Haight's interpretation of this is, and Lee's interpretation eventually, is, well then, that must mean that Brigham wants the Indians to go take care of this for us. And so what we're going to do is go tell the Indians what's going on and let them go put at least a scare into them. Lee said, they put this plan together. Before the meeting ended, Lee said he asked Haight if it would be well to hold a council of the brethren before making a move. Haight replied, we can't now delay for a council of the brethren. He would bring the matter before a council on Sunday. As I was reviewing this, I think it was you, Steve, that told me this. Talking about President Ricks and his statement. What is it they always says about time? We always have time. Time is on our side. And sometimes people get frustrated because it takes them a while to get things done. We had 7 weeks without an elders quorum president when we split our ward once, or a high priest group leadership back in the day. But I really, as I'm reading through this, I'm starting to appreciate that statement. We always have time. Had they followed the council system, I firmly believe that this would have never happened. In fact, if I were to look at one principle out of Mountain Meadow Massacre, councils, use them properly and abide by what they decide.
Was the southern border of Utah kind of where it is today? Were they concerned that these guys are getting off scot-free because they're about to cross state lines and we're out of our jurisdiction?
Not so much jurisdiction. Jurisdiction's loose back then. The problem was that they're going to get to California. Well, eventually the problem is if they get to California and tell them what we did, and word gets back to the federal government, and we've already got an army marching against us, we're in really big trouble. Yeah, the cover-up is intense.
William Dame was initially opposed. He and Haight talked, and he tells years that Saints and Cedars actions. So especially because they have wagon trains coming right behind them, they're going to see what's going so that's when he makes sense. Go ahead. And he later tries to go back on that, but it's too late. So it's just, it was really bad.
We'll talk Tambar Council in just a minute and how that comes about. So,
Right.
Yep. it's off. Done. So they decide they don't have time for a council. Lee says he wants a council, but by the time Sunday gets there, he stands up and turns Saccharin basically into a war rally. Here we go. Now, let's see, I'm going to read to you this statement. Gentiles had driven the saints from Nauvoo, causing some to perish, he reminded his audience. Now, he said, Gentile immigrants had stirred trouble in Cedar City, including at Haight's home. You going to let them get our stake president like that? Threatening an attack not only on the leaders, but also on every other damn Mormon in the country, they said. Lee asked his listeners to show agreement by raising their hands. In the end, the decision for many may have come down to what they thought their leaders wanted. So, of course, they lifted up their hands, as that was the law, remembered Annie Elizabeth Pogue. The supporting vote carried by a large majority, though some, like Pogue, hesitated. She started to vote her opposition, but dropped her hand. And 2 or 3 in the congregation opposed Lee. Interesting to ask yourself. In fact, I'm kind of curious. Do you think you would have had it in you to vote against it?
How many people were in this group?
I don't know. It's Saccharin meeting.
So it's a congregation of a lot of saints,
It's not
a
7.
small count.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. Do you think you'd have had it in you to vote against it?
But I thought it was all that had happened.
It's awfully hard to figure out.
You sound like I tend to get riled up pretty easy.
And you're riled up already, and then you get in there and he gets up at the podium and, are we going to let him do this to us?
Now let's take the sacrament, everyone.
Yeah, right?
Hurry.
Bishop, you think your ward's crazy. Again, in no way are we saying what they did was fine, but you can start to see how this gets out of hand. So, the place where the plan, and at this point, everybody seems to be rallying behind it. But then it starts to unravel. We get to about 4 p.m., and they start to meet together to have the council, the promised council that's coming. And Laban Morrill starts saying, whoa, 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 you're going to do what? Do not our principles of right teach us to return good for evil and do good to those that despitefully use us? And then he asks the $1 million question. By what authority? What are you doing? How are you doing this? Who said you could? And they have to say, and all of a sudden everybody's like, wait a minute, what? And they realize we're kind of pushing it on this. You know what? Here's what we're going to do. Send an express rider to Brigham Young, see what he wants us to do, and we're going to hold off. This worked perfectly. This is how councils are supposed to work. Doug Katzenbach comes in all riled up and hot-headed, and we get somebody to cool him down, right? And we hear the different opinions on it, and we say, okay, we have a better idea now. Everybody speaks freely. There's no dictatorship going on. It worked. The problem is, remember they said earlier, Haight says, we can't wait for a council, we need to move. John D. Lee's already been stirring up the Paiutes. He's got them all riled up, and they're already over at the meadow surrounding the wagon train, waiting to act. In the meantime, they're waiting. The time wasn't it wasn't the designated time yet to jump on them. But one of the Indians has a dream, and kind of a confusing dream, but they take it as an omen that they're supposed to act quicker. And so they say, let's do this. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the details on this.
We're speaking.
Right.
Sorry, it was a miss.
Yeah, well, there's some of, so what do we do while we wait? And they're doing target practice. So there's some gunshots going on. I'm sure if you ask John D. Lee, the immigrants fired first. um, and,
What was the motivation for the Paiute to go participate?
okay, so looting is, and so they go in, and John D. Lee says, the question was, what's the motivation for the Paiutes? You go in, do a little scare, take their cattle, and whatever you want, and leave them be. Later on, they have Lee and Haight discussing this, and I can't remember who says to who, but basically says, you know who they are. You really think that they're going to go in there and just take the cattle and kill the men? Even we do this, there's going to be a lot of lives lost, and that's acknowledged from the onset. Let's keep going because I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so Alex brought up a minute ago. We have this council. By the time we get back, though, the shots have been fired, and we have, I can't remember how many teams, people that are wounded or dead out of the Arkansas group. The problem is a couple of them are out. A couple of the Arkansas company are out. They stumble onto a couple of men, a couple of the Mormons, and the Mormons, knowing that we're trying to take down this whole group, what happens if we have two riders that are out of the circle that come back and stumble onto this massacre? They sit there for a minute, have a nice casual conversation with them, and then they ask if they have anything that they can drink. When the Arkansas guy leans back to grab his canteen, they shoot him. They go to shoot the other guy, gun misfires, he gets away. Now we've got a real problem. Because now they know this wasn't the Indians, this was the Mormons that did this, or at least the Indians and the Mormons. So, they hold another special council Monday night. They go through this whole thing. Again, they decide we're just going to let him go. We got to end this. This is getting out of control. It's going downhill fast. We got to let him go. Afterwards, Haight sticks around for a minute and says, well, here's Haight's comment later. I would give a world if we had abided by the decision of the council. Instead, Haight asked Dane for a private session immediately after the meeting. It was right there and then that the whole program and plan was changed. Haight probably shared with Dane details that he was unwilling to mention at the earlier council. The immigrants' recognition of Lee as a white man. There's an incident where they see him basically creeping around and identify him. They send out two little 4-year-old boys to go meet with him with a white flag. So they know now that there's white people there. That's a problem. And again, we talked about this. If this got back to President Buchanan and we've got an army coming already, it's not just us that's in trouble. They could take out the whole state. They could take Brigham's life. And all of a sudden, we've twisted things. And again, outside of a council setting, things get contorted. And now all of a sudden, it's if we don't massacre this wagon train, the church could fall. Is how they're seeing things. Express Rider is en route. By the way, the Express Rider does a fantastic job of getting up to Salt Lake. I think it takes him 3 days to get to Salt Lake. They told him he has a letter that says every bishop along the way, give him your best horse or fastest horse. And they actually think he could have gotten back a lot faster, but a lot of the bishops drug their feet at giving up their horses. And the reason that they were dragging their feet was it's a hard ride and it's rough on your horses. And so he says he spends as much time trying to find horses as he does riding, trying to get up there. Which is problematic too. He gets done, get there to Brigham. He says, Brigham, what do we do? Brigham's like, well, you're not going to attack him. Comes back. He walked the rider to the hitching post. He gives him an hour or two to rest. It's just an hour. He walked the rider back to the hitching post near the outer gate and repeated his instructions several times as Haslam mounted the horse and adjusted the saddle girth. Brother Haslam, the instructed, I want you to ride for dear life. Ride day and night, spare no horse flesh. you get there. They need to know this. We'll talk about when he gets there in a minute.
What time period is this, or what's happening?
This is, I've got my timeline here. See, Saturday they gather the Indians. Sunday, I think, is when they sent him out to ride.
He's 3 days later.
Yeah, well, this goes on for about a week and a half. The whole thing. Sunday he starts riding, so he must get there Tuesday. That's what I'm guessing a little bit on that, to be honest. Sunday is when he starts riding. The massacre takes place on Friday when they get out there. So he's got Sunday to Friday to get there and back. And he shows back up on Sunday. He's gone for a week. Sometimes that's a little bit fuzzy of a timeline, but it should give you an idea. When Brigham says it, nothing's happened yet. Is that a good enough
That was
statement?
what I was asking.
Yeah.
So, is anything happening as far as the 7
Well, yes, there has been some shots fired, but the shots fired thing would be a very trivial aspect of Mormon history, if not for what goes on after that. Oops.
Well, he says you got to Salt Lake on
Wednesday, okay.
Friday.
Gosh, I'm way off on my spot. So I'm going to read to you now some of the statements of what happens. Gosh, where is this? Is a long place. Really don't. Okay, so they come up with this new plan. This has got to be the most cowardly military operation ever performed. The way they do it makes it so much worse. So here's what happens. It explains in here, they lured the immigrants from the circle of wagons with a false flag of truce. They go in under a white flag. This is, the fact that they do it under a white flag makes it so much worse to me. They go into the immigrants, and the line is, you need to trust us. The Indians want to destroy you. Come with us, we'll protect you. And there's a lot of people there that just don't buy it, and they're concerned that something's fishy here. We don't like what's going on, but basically, what other choice do they have? They march them out, and they say, "Here's what we're going to do. All of the women and children we're going to send ahead in the wagons, and walking along up in front, and then we're going to take every one of the men. We're going to personally protect you." And we'll match 1-for-1 our militia with your men. And so they walk out in a single file line, walking right next to the person. The plan is they're going to get to a certain point, and when Higbee gives we haven't talked much about Higbee, but when Higbee gives the signal, which is shouting the word halt, they turn to the person next to them and shoot them. How I wish that it was not more gruesome than that. But it was. The reason they had them in two different groups was that the Mormons were going to take care of the citizens were going to take care of the older ones, the boys and men. And then they didn't want to, it would have been unethical to kill all of the women and children, so they let the Indians do that. By the way, they get going out there, and there's a point where Higbee stalls, and you can tell at least the recollection of it is you're looking at it and trying to interpret it is that he's hesitant to give the command, but he does.
Higbee's position is just
yeah, he's one of the commanders in in the bunch. I can't remember what priesthood position he has. This is the part that I actually physically get sick reading. As I reviewed my notes yesterday in my office, it actually brought me to tears again, reading through how things go down. Slaughter. They use the word slaughter appropriately. Higby says he apparently, Klingensmith, who's the bishop, who is also there, watches Higby kill a man, and he says, let's see. It appears that Higby and his victim knew each other. John M. Higby went up to him and drew his knife out and cut his throat. The man begged for his life. He said, Higby, I wouldn't do this to you. Higby replied, you've done something just as bad. Moments after Higby gave his order, Johnson, who was still on the hill overlooking the militia and the Paiutes, gave the word to the Indians to fire. They rose up from the hiding place, yelling and whooping, some rushing towards the front of the group of women and children, and others towards the back. At first, the terrified women and children ran back towards their men until the Indians headed them off, said William Young, who watched the slaughter from the ridge near the militia camp. The Indians hurled rocks at them, and I saw them fall from the rocks and laid on the ground as though they was dead. Carl Schurz's father said, the women and children were knocked down with stones, clubs, gun barrels, struck in the neck and butchered like hogs. Young saw one Indian use a large rock to crush life from a teenage boy who had fallen. 2 or 3 times the man raised the rock and crushed it on the boy's chest. One large woman, following for her husband and children, somehow made it through the white men, only to be shot in the back by one of them. When she fell, Klingensmith remembered there was no quiver. Some more stuff. Learning of the final massacre at the Meadows, 3 of the immigrants' best scouts had crept out of the wagon corral and scrambled towards California. This is before. They've got a letter with a record of every person that was in there, in the wagon train, and all of their possessions, which will be significant in a minute. And they're going to California to get help. According to one account, Paiutes surrounded them, stripped them of their clothes, and told them to run for their lives. Wounded by an arrow in the capture, one of the 2 men did not get far. His captors tied him to a stake, and faggots were soon blazing around the quivering body. Continuing west to Cottonwood Springs, this is the other guy, he met 2 Mormon brothers, Henry and McCann Young, who were en route from California to Utah. One of the young brothers said that when they met Baker, he seemed to be terror-stricken. His mind was wandering. He babbled incoherently about the massacre and of his purposes. Knowing nothing about the manhunt for Baker, the young brothers gave him a horse to ride and persuaded him to turn back, believing he would die if he tried to cross the blazing deserts ahead. Although accounts of Baker's fate vary, the 3 men apparently ran into a search party of Paiutes led by Ira Hatch, who told the Youngs that Baker had to die. No sooner had they said the word, McGlashan's account explained, than the Indians discharged a shower of arrows at the poor fellow. One Indian put an end to the torture by striking the man on the head with a stone, crushing his skull. Those are the adults. There was a significant number of children there as well. This gives the breakdown. 3 dozen or more of the children, 2/3 of them girls, were aged 12 and younger. Half of them below the age of 7. Some of them they let live, as if that was a good thing. A lot of them probably would have preferred to go. Okay, here's where it gets rough. Rebecca Dunlap, 6 years old at the time, remembered the terror. She ran and hid in a cluster of sagebrush. She also heard her 1-year-old sister, Sarah, crying. Now she's seen her 1-year-old sister and thinking, I have to save her. She found the infant entwined in their dead mother's arms. Sarah had been shot through her right arm below the elbow by a large ball, breaking both bones and cutting her arm half off. Rebecca pulled Sarah free and took her back onto the sagebrush to hide. She stayed with them until she saw a white man and begged him for help. She was spared only because of her age, which apparently would have been less than 12, because you're going to see what happens here. Well, in a minute we will. Sarah Frances Baker remembered sitting on her wounded father George's lap in one of the wagons when the same bullet that snubbed out his life took a nick out of her left ear. Sarah wasn't quite 3 years old. But even when you're that young, she maintained more than 80 years later. You don't forget the horror of having your father gasp for breath and grow limp while you have your arms around his neck screaming with terror. You wouldn't forget it either, she said, if you saw your own mother topple over in the wagon beside you with the big red splotch getting bigger and bigger on the front of her calico dress. Samuel Pollock said, some of the children with their heads mashed in by rock, or he said, it's a horrible manner that all the bodies were butchered in a horrible manner. Some of the children with their heads mashed by rocks, I suppose. Klingesmith gave a similar description. I found the bodies in almost every condition, he said, some with their throats cut, some heads smashed, some shot. Few, if any, scalps were taken. When Jacob Hamlin explained the victims' skeletons in 1858, he observed that about 1/3 seemed to be broken in with stones. The two Dunlap sisters are about 12 years old. They make it through down to the end, hiding in some bushes. When Lee came down the road after the killing at the wagons, the Cedar City chief brought the girls out and asked him what he should do with them. The Paiute did not want the girls killed because they were pretty, Lee later told Jacob Hamlin. But Lee insisted. They was too big and too old to let live, he said. Lee claimed he told the Indian to shoot one of them, and he cut the other girl's throat. 12-year-old girls. Hamlin goes back later on and he says, that's the story that gets told, but I saw the bodies and they both had cut throats. To make matters worse, they loot the bodies. We won't go into details much on that. The bodies, and they take some of the wagons. At the close of the massacre, there was 18 children still alive. One girl, some 10 or 12 years old, they said was too big and could tell, so they killed her. I want you to imagine the horror of that moment. When you're standing there with a group of kids and they say, who's too old, so we have to kill them. And they look around and they say, that one. I don't know which situation's worse at that point, being the one who gets shot or being the rest of them that witness it. They take him down to Jacob Hamlin's home. His wife is now taking care of her children along with the 17 children that come to her. Some babies were still nursing him and wailed for the comfort of their mother's breasts. It was rough. And that was just a few of the details that I pulled out of the book. There's more. Haslam gets back, gives Haight the unsealed letter from Young, directing him to let the immigrants go in peace. Haight took the letter, read through it, and broke down for half an hour. He sobbed like a child and could manage only the words, too late, too late. That's on Sunday. So we're now 2 days past this, or probably a day after he gets the information. 9 men get indicted. Most of them end up running. And so only John D. Lee ends up getting shot. Getting executed for this. They actually have a hung jury the first time with John D. Lee's trial, and then they convict him the second time. The story, interestingly, they take him back to Mountain Meadows to execute him. 100-mile journey in a bumpy wagon with a lot of reporters following. There's a picture of it in here. I don't know if this is exactly how it goes down, but no, I didn't really show it. So everybody get it. In the picture, they show him falling into his casket as they shoot him. He does give some interviews right at the end, and clarifies a few things that help, including that Brigham Young had not authorized the whole thing. It's all a little questionable. Some of the stuff that gets said is put in there by his lawyer. His lawyer had some conflicts of interest, specifically that he was writing a book about the whole thing. And so he has some motive to make some kind of explosive comments to sell books. I think we've covered most of what I want to hit. I know we're just a minute over. I'll see if there's just a couple last things. Going back to the comments that led to this, Brigham Young had made some stuff, and that's why they justify it of saying he did not authorize Mountain Meadows, but he had made some comments that made them feel like it was justified, and saying things like the buzzards are going to pick their bones. If they do make it to Salt Lake, we're going to burn the place to the ground. They're not taking another one of our cities. And you can just see kind of the fight and words that come with it. We shall have the Lamanites with us. That's his big thing. They're gonna help us fight this. You can start to see a little bit how they can misconstrue some things. Again, stop. Tell the immigrants don't come because we're not going to hold back the Indians. I'll bet that speech sounded different a few hundred miles south. I'll bet in their minds it sounded a little bit more like, go ahead and let the Indians do their thing. It's time for us to get revenge. George A. Smith, Steve and I have had a lot of conversations on this, had been making a tour through southern Utah and given some of these Reformation speeches leading up to the massacre. He repeats some of the stuff, including that this group of people that's coming in plan to hang 300 of the most obnoxious Mormons. And he says, the army, that's one thing, but it's actually the immigrants you've got to worry about. They're the worst ones. Making great calculations for booty and beauty. That's the line they have before it's saying. Slightly vulgar in here, but basically says anybody who helps them, protect them. We talked a little about the verbal confrontations. There's some accusations that the Indians had poisoned some people along the way. Poison was kind of the catch-all that you would use at the time. Somebody dies, and clearly they got poisoned. It's a ridiculous supposition to say it didn't happen. The amount of poison they would have needed to do it. They give the Indians a cow or an ox, I can't remember, an animal that had died the night before, and then several of the Indians die, and they say, they're out to get us. They weren't. It probably was more that the cow had died and probably shouldn't have eaten it if it died of natural causes the day before. George A. Smith makes the comment. Here's one lighter comment in a very heavy lesson. I just thought this was Heber C. Kimball. Heber C. Kimball's plain-spoken, or Brigham Young's plain-spoken first counselor ended his remarks in his typical earthy style. Send 2,500 troops here to make a desolation of this people, he exclaimed. I have wives enough to whip out the United States, but they will whip themselves. Again, one lighthearted quote in a very, very serious topic. George A. Smith, the record is that he's down there and talking, and he asks, so what do you think we should do with John D. Lee? What do you think we should do? What do you think the Brethren would do if a group of immigrants came through and tried to rough things up? And he says, take them down, basically, and he says, that's what I think too. Now, the historical accounts on this, everybody has a motive. Everybody has a motive, so you got to be careful with stuff. I think we're good to wrap this up. It's tragic, and I think there are some very applicable things for us to learn from it. One, we need to watch our emotions pretty closely and not get too caught up in the feelings we have of things. Two, we need to abide by counsels. And three, we need to listen to our prophet and make sure that we're doing his actual will what he's actually said, not our maybe more extreme and personally motivated interpretation of it, amongst many others. We were wrong. I'm a Cedar City boy. The people of Cedar City were wrong in what they did. I hope that we'll learn lessons from it. I don't know that any of us are ever going to be put in a situation where we have a similar setup like Mountain Meadows. But on a smaller scale, I think there's a lot to learn, and we owe it to the people that lost their lives in it to learn the lessons from us so we don't repeat them. Regardless of what happened, I know the gospel is true and that we have priesthood leaders on the earth that are inspired from God. When we listen to them, we're safe. It's my testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Nathan, will you pray for us?